Book 2. Noah, everyone who reads it must converse. And we're here to tackle the second chapter of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. This is my copy. I like it. I like the cover and everything like this. This is a Barnes & Noble Classic Edition. It doesn't have any kind of supplemental material to it, so I'm using Don Gifford's Joyce Annotated. This is a great work. This actually is annotations for Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man and also Dubliners. All the short stories in Dubliners. So I'm just going through this along with my reading, but I'm going to lean heavily on the text for my analysis here because I'm doing chapter 2. So chapter 1 is done by my cohort, Lucas, at Bits of Lit. If you haven't seen his chapter 1, then shoot on over there. I'll have a link in the description there so that you can just get the chapter 1 before I jump into chapter 2 for you. And thanks for anyone who's coming along with us, reading along. Boom. And if you're just here, have read it before and here to enjoy analysis, then thank you as well. Very cool. So, chapter 1, this was my first foray into Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. I haven't read it before. Bloomsday, this 2020. So, very cool. But chapter 1, I was kind of wandering around, through chapter 1. I'm like, how old is Stephen? One, how old is Stephen Dedalus in this? He seems like he's just, third grader, fourth grader, maybe, right? 12 years old, something like that. So, and I think I was about right on that. I think that, I don't know how the school system is set up in Ireland, but how it is here, he would be, in primary school in the first chapter, maybe getting into secondary school in some of the scenes and things like that. But in chapter 2, we're firmly into Stephen as a young man, not as a kid. Maybe in chapter 1 he was a kid the whole time, and in chapter 2 he's a young man for sure. And so, and this is why I'm going to lean heavily on the text here, because chapter 2 is more than any other chapter, as far as I could tell, a series of portraits. Just a series of portraits in Stephen's experience that gives him, context for his life. So what I want to do is just touch on some of these scenes and portraits, and then give my kind of thoughts on it, what I've kind of got out of it, and I hope you enjoy it, guys. So the first part, just real quick off chapter 2, he develops a love. He falls in love with a book, and I'm sure all of us on BookTube can relate to that. So he falls in love with the Count of Monte Cristo. What an amazing story, right? If anybody is not aware, I'll go through a little bit of the context of the story, but it's well worth a read. And if you don't feel like reading it, it's very dated, and if old books are not your thing, then the movie with Guy Pearce and James Caviezel, I believe is his name, is well done, even though they do change quite a bit about the story. But the story is a huge story. So when I say his and he in this, we're talking about Stephen Dedalus, the main character, of course. His evenings were his own. As he pored over a ragged translation of the Count of Monte Cristo, the figure of that dark avenger stood forth in his mind, for whatever he had heard or divined in childhood of the strange and terrible. At night he built up the parlor table, an image of the wonderful island cave, out of transfers and paper flowers and colored tissue paper and strips of the silver and golden paper in which chocolate is wrapped. When he had broken up this scenery, weary of its tinsel, we would come to his then there would come to his mind the bright picture of Marseille, of sunny trestles, and of Mercedes. So Mercedes is the love in the Count of Monte Cristo, the one that is this ideal. So Stephen is definitely in this idealized. He's an idyllic youth. As a young man, he is, idealizing his life, idealizing his place in life, and idealizing love, what he might see as love and his love interest in the future. And so he's completely taken by the Count of Monte Cristo, rereads it. You get this feeling that he's read it and reread it, and actually doing some kind of applying these kind of things to his life. So it's a cool thing. It's very cool. I like it, and he's kind of in this fantasy world in this kind of area of the book in chapter 2, where he's envisioning a country cottage where his Mercedes is at and living, by seeing this girl. He never approaches her, he never says anything to her, but she becomes just a visual, actual representation in life for this idealized, this ideal of love. So just right after the coming of September did not trouble him this year, for he was not sent back to Clongowes. That is the school that he was going to, a private school, a very kind of a school run by the church. And the school that Stephen is a part of is an Orthodox Catholic church, and of the Jesuit order. Jesuits the Jesuit order was started by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and he wrote a book called The Spiritual Exercises. It is an amazing work of spiritual practice. If you are not aware of, I just had to throw that out there because I love it for sure. And so he's becoming, kind of disillusioned with school because of the kind of portraits and the kind of memories that he's had, that I'm sure Lucas is touching on in part 1, in chapter 1. So his family not only cannot send him back to, his private school because of lack of money. Simon Dedalus, his father, is obviously a bit of a rascal, not to say an alcoholic, and maybe not so good with money. So the family has fallen on hard times. They can't afford to send him back, but also they have to move now. And so it comes upon Stephen suddenly, of course, right? Because the parents are not gonna, have to let their children in on every step of the process of decision making, or what has gone on to lead them to this decision. So it comes upon him suddenly. So the passage is this: the sudden flight from the comfort and reverie of Blackrock, the passage through the gloomy, foggy city, the thought of the bare, cheerless house in which they were now to live, made his heart heavy. And again an intuition, a foreknowledge of the future came to him. He understood also why the servants had often whispered together in the hall, and why his father had often stood on the hearthrug with his back to the fire, talking loudly to Uncle Charles, who urged him to sit down and eat his dinner. "There's a crack of the whip left in me yet, Stephen, old chap," said Mr. Dedalus, his father, poking at the dull fire with a fierce energy. "We're not dead yet, sonny. No, by the Lord Jesus, God forgive me, nor half dead." So, we just get those kind of little snippets, and I love it. These kind of little snippets, totally like a picture of something that had happened in Stephen's experience that was formative to him. And that's just all we're going to come up against right now. I'm going to go through one or two or three real quick here. He went once or twice with his mother to visit their relatives, and though they passed a jovial array of shops lit up and adorned for Christmas, his mood of embittered silence did not leave him. He was sitting on the backless chair in his aunt's kitchen. A lamp with a reflector hung on the japanned wall of the fireplace, and by its light his aunt, who was reading the evening paper that lay on her knees. She looked a long time at a smiling picture that was set in it and said musingly, "The beautiful Mabel Hunter." A ringleted girl on tiptoe to peer at the picture and said softly, "What is she in, Mud?" "That is in pantomime, love." The child leaned her ringleted hair against her mother's sleeve, gazing on the picture, and murmured as if fascinated, "The beautiful Mabel Hunter." As if fascinated, her eyes rested long upon those demurely taunting eyes, and she murmured devotedly, "Isn't she an exquisite creature?" And the boy who came in from the street, stamping crookedly under his stone of coal, heard her words. Just a beautiful little portrait, huh? Of just like, just a seemingly normal happening. This is something that the aunt is interested in, gazing upon, a famous, actress or something like that. In the annotated, it says that Mabel Hunter was actually billed in the theater for something, but the actual article that it is referring to is not in the system. So kind of weird, huh? When it comes down to it, Joyce, who knows what Joyce is doing with all that. Next, he was sitting in the narrow breakfast room high up in the old dark windowed house. The firelight flickered on the wall, and beyond the window a spectral dusk was gathering upon the river. Before the fire an old woman was busy making tea, and as she bustled about the task, she told in a low voice what the priest and the doctor had said. She too of certain changes, as they had seemed to her of late in her, and of her odd ways and sayings. He sat listening to the words and following the ways of adventure that lay open in the coals, arches and vaults and winding galleries and jagged taverns. Next, he was sitting in the midst of a children's party at Harold's Cross. His silent, watchful manner had grown upon him, and he took little part in the games. And then, so all these lead into different just scenes, just one right after another. And you can see the kind of way that it starts off. He went once or twice with his mother. He was sitting in the narrow breakfast room. He was sitting in the midst of a children's party. That's all the segue that there is between these portraits, as Joyce is expounding on different scenes that are formative to Stephen's mind state, and what family means. And in this kind of in this portrait right here in chapter 2, and what I've shared so far, we're getting what family is, and this family system that he's built into, or that is built around him, and that he's trying to navigate through. So it's very, very cool, and not imposing at all. You just kind of get them, and then you're kind of left with, well, what does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it is on the surface of it, pretty much. Stephen is a person just like any of us, although he may be a little more philosophical and inward thinking, an inward soul, even at a younger age than a lot of people might be. But I think that might be a character of Joyce as well. So the next part, just the very next page. It was the last tram. The lank brown horses knew it and shook their bells in the clear night in admonition. So this is a scene just at a train station that is actually very formative for Stephen, because we just kind of saw in the first part of the chapter what his idea of love is, because he has no context for that, romantic love and what that means. And so we have this portrait next. No sound or footsteps came up or down the road. No sound broke the peace of the night, save when the lank brown horses rubbed their noses together and shook their bells. They seemed to listen, he on the upper step and she on the lower. She came up to his step many times and went down to hers again between their phrases, and once or twice stood close beside him for some moments on the upper step, forgetting to go down, and then went down. His heart danced upon her movements like a cork upon a tide. He heard what her eyes said to him from beneath their cowl, and knew that in some dim past, whether in life or reverie, he had heard their tale before. He saw her urge her vanities, her fine dress and sash and long black stockings, and knew that he had yielded to them 1,000 times. Yet a voice within him spoke above the noise of his dancing heart, asking him if he would take her gift, to which he had only stretched out his hand. And he remembered the day when he and Eileen had stood looking into the hotel grounds, watching the waiters running up a trail of bunting on the flagstaff and the fox terrier scampering to and fro on the sunny lawn, and how all of a sudden she had broken into a peal of laughter and had run down the sloping curve of the path. Now as then he stood listily in his place, seemingly a tranquil watcher on the scene before him. She too wants me to catch hold of her, he thought. That's why she came with me to the tram. I could easily catch hold of her when she comes up to my step. Nobody is looking. I could hold her and kiss her, but he did neither. So she leaves. And so then we have a scene of what I see as missed opportunity. Something that kind of haunts Stephen. You know, I think any man has this kind of memory, and perhaps women as well. And perhaps it is a universal thing. But when you're in that situation and you know that, or you get the feeling that you only need to make a move to have an experience, but what it comes down to is you don't have the courage at that point, or the gusto, or whatever it might be. There's a reason. There's something intellectual that gets in the way, or there's something that just in your like I say, your metal in your heart that kind of gets in and doesn't allow you to take that step. And so then afterwards, what do you feel? Regret, you know, or you feel like as there might be a missed opportunity. And so this kind of thing, I feel is a very pointed thing for Stephen. And that's it. You know, the next day, you know, we're right on. So this chapter is really just a series of these portraits, and right after that, we get into a whole nother scene here, where actually what happens is the family, the Deadless family, is not doing so well. You know, they're really not. The the father, Simon Dedalus, is not doing very well with the finances of the family. So we have a scene where he actually is leaving out with his father and going to sell some of the family property. And okay, well, before that, there's another scene that I wanted to touch on first. Sorry. When it comes, it starts off with a kind of a conversation that's going on right now, like the now of chapter 2, and where somebody, it's when he is accused of heresy in his school, to have written something that is seen as heresy. And he quickly, changes the tune and makes the guy, makes the teacher, the prefect or whatever it is that's questioning him, and makes him happy. But what is said is admit, to him. And it kind of throws him into another scene where you're in Stephen's head and you're thinking, or he's thinking and remembering this time of being bullied by seeming friends, but what they're doing is they're pressing him to tell him who's the greatest writer, and they say Newman, Newman, Cardinal Newman comes up, Lord Tennyson comes up, and Stephen says that Byron is the greatest writer, poet, for sure. And now Byron is not a Catholic. Byron is heretical and labeled as heretical by the Catholic Church. So these other youths, seemingly Stephen's friends, start to actually beat on him and hold him, and what they're saying is this: admit that Byron was no good. No. Admit. No. Admit. No. And so two pages before is this kind of scene that ends with admit, a prefect at the school saying admit, and leads to this whole nother scene, this whole other story, where he's getting picked on and bullied about his taste in poetics and in literature by his buddies. And that scene ends with them holding him and bullying him and saying, admit that your pick for the greatest writer is both a heretic and no good. Admit that he's no good. So it's cool how Joyce uses those kind of poetics himself, that these kind of scenes are random, it seems sometimes, and they hold together. They hold together by the language sometimes. They hold together by Stephen's thought other times. They hold together by the actual subject or an idea that is underlying other times. So it's pretty cool. Very, very cool. And so after that is the scene where his father is actually having to go and sell some of the family property because of financial troubles. And Stephen accompanies him, and what it turns into is going and handling business, and then turns into a pub crawl where Simon Dedalus is meeting up with some old friends in the city. Cork is the town, perhaps a city, Cork, where Simon Dedalus actually went to university. So he's meeting up with some old friends, and they're having a good old time drinking and reminiscing, right? So this is when Simon and Stephen are walking together around Cork, and he's remembering this scene and remembering what his father said. He could still hear his father's voice. When you kick out for yourself, Stephen, as I dare say you will one of these days, remember, whatever you do, to mix with gentlemen. When I was a young fellow, I tell you I enjoyed myself. I mixed with fine, decent fellows. Every one of us could do something. One fellow had a good voice. Another fellow was a good actor. Another could sing a good comic song. Another was a good oarsman or a good racket player. Another could tell a good story, and so on. We kept the ball rolling anyhow, and we enjoyed ourselves and saw a bit of life. And when we were none the worse, and we were none the worse for it either. But we were all gentlemen, Stephen. At least I hope we were, and bloody good honest Irishmen too. That's the kind of fellows I want you to associate with. Fellows of the right kidney. I'm talking to you as a friend, Stephen. I don't believe a son should be afraid of his father. No, I treat you as your grandfather treated me when I was a young chap. So, I think that any young man, or any man, any person, any man can remember that kind of conversation with his father. You know, if the father and the son have a true kind of father-son relationship, you can remember having the kind of talk when the father is letting the guard down and saying, look, I'm not talking to you right now as a son, as my son, and telling you what to do. I'm talking to you as a friend, and this is what I want for you, okay? And it turns out to be a kind of do as I say, not as I do, right? Because Simon is by no means, a gentleman as far as what we see in the portrait. I'm sure Lucas is going to touch on the dinner, where we see very quickly that Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, is very antagonistic and messing up, Christmas dinner by an argument. So it just is what it is. And in reference to this conversation in this portrait, Stephen says, I am Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork, in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in the Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon and Stephen and Victoria. Names. So Stephen is reflecting and trying to just establish context for his place in the world. And we get an idea of this young man, a very good, a very awesomely expressed portrait of a young man that is defining himself, finding identity. And he's trying to find identity, and he's perfectly okay with not having identity. It's not that he is, he's not in a dark place, although Stephen does show a lot of self-doubt and maybe some self-esteem issues, things like that. But I think that it's more like that Stephen is just an introvert. Stephen is an introverted person, and he is very much more concerned with his inner life than he is with what people think of him or what he should do or whatever. So then the next thing, like I said, it turns into a pub crawl with Simon Dedalus's friends showing up from university, and I just wanted to share this little part. Another brisk old man whom Mr. Dedalus called Johnny Cashman, had covered him with confusion by asking him to say which were prettier, the Dublin girls or the Cork girls. "He is not that way built," said Simon. "Leave him alone. He's a level-headed thinking boy who does not bother his head about this kind of nonsense." And that's true. You know, for the most part, Stephen is not concerned with other people, and he's not concerned with the outer, like kind of, like I said, like what might be expected of him, except for, he does have a very good sense of duty, and he is, he performs what is expected of him, like at school, or as far as his efforts to to be responsible, things like that. He performs those things very well. He's very responsible, but he's very self-reflective, and he's not out there looking at girls and ran by some kind of outward motivations like that. The next portrait, and the final portrait to this chapter 2, is where Stephen actually leaves out by himself, and I look to see this as like maybe 15, 16 years old at this point, and he goes out and he meets a prostitute, and he has his encounter, his first encounter, that is actually physical in nature and with a woman, and he has no idea what to do, but of course the prostitute knows exactly what to do, right? And so she passed her tinkling hand through his hair, calling him a little rascal. "Give me a kiss," she said, but his lips would not bend to kiss her. He wanted to be held firmly in her arms, to be caressed slowly, slowly, slowly. In her arms he felt that he had suddenly become strong and fearless and sure of himself, but his lips would not bend to kiss her. With a sudden movement, she bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but this dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, and though they were the vehicle of a vague speech, and between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the swoon of sin, softer than the sound or odor. So, we have a very explicit, coming of age at tale here, and I'm definitely eager to get on to more. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Chapter 2 is the one that is the most, I think, of just a series of snapshots and portraits of Stephen's life. So we get to get a good kind of overview of what it's like to grow up. Maybe, 13 or 14 to 16, right there. And the kind of different things that stick with somebody for the rest of their life. So I hope you enjoyed this booktube. Thank you for coming along. Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. It's on. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.